Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
We're going to be talking about Naked Lunch, the book and the movie. We're just kind of going to be talking about all things naked and lunch and William S. Burroughs. And to help us with that task, we have employed our friend Daniel Coffeen. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, everybody.
I would normally sort of go, Daniel Coffeen is a, but like, Jesus Christ, man, what do you tell people? Like both at a bar or a business meeting where you want something from someone, what do you tell people you do? And
I'm a sophist.
That means nothing to anybody but to the two other people in this room.
Yeah, it's obnoxious. I just parry the question. I always defer and parry. Do you want a shtick? You want me to give you a shtick?
Yeah. Give us like the elevator.
My elevator shtick?
Yeah.
I'm a sophist, and I write, and I used to teach at UC Berkeley, and I write about things like Deleuze and Nietzsche and Burroughs, and I got my nifty little book everyone should go buy, Zero
Absolutely.
Books.
On Zero Books, it is called
Reading the Way of Things Towards a New Technology of Making Sense. And I blog, and I write, and I podcast, and I make money doing obscene things I'd rather not talk about.
All right. All right, to prepare our listeners, our next episode, we will be covering the 2009 movie Zombieland, it's on Amazon Prime right now, so subscribers can watch that easily. And you can write to us at scarythoughts.org. And anybody got anything to plug at the moment? I don't.
Nope.
Chad, Daniel?
No.
New book, conference, lecture, other podcasts?
Soon, Renegade University. I'll have a Nietzsche lecture live up there within a month, I think.
Oh, is that the Thaddeus Russell thing?
Thaddeus Russell,
cool.
Yeah. They're going to relaunch the whole platform. So the Nietzsche class is already done. It's already recorded. It's just being proofed and needs to be uploaded. But I think going to do a class on Burroughs. Is going to be the next class. Maybe Burroughs, maybe the Beats, maybe Burroughs and Ginsberg, but definitely Burroughs.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. And last thing before we get started is spoilers ahead. Although, Jesus Christ, I don't think there's anything to spoil about Naked Lunch or Burroughs in general.
Yeah.
All right. So where do we want to start?
Well, you can really start anywhere with this book, right? Hey.
That's brilliant, though. That's
Yeah.
one of the great things. And what's surprising, actually, it's funny. I'm so torn on the movie, because there's so many things I kind of love about it. But it's actually a good question. Can you come in, considering the book has no sort of narrative, right? It doesn't really matter. It's one of the best things about Burroughs is there's no linearity. And that's something he purposefully, aggressively disrupts, right? And he was obsessed with cinema. And I always thought cinema was so far ahead of the novel. And so he always wanted to introduce temporal folds, simultaneity. It's a lot of where the cut-up comes from, was trying to fold different times together. He started with newspapers, different years next to each other. You can pick up Naked Lunch anywhere, which I love because I never read books linearly. But to me, a question would be, can you read the movie? Does the movie need to be watched in order?
Yeah, and I think that's actually one of the I wouldn't say flaws, but to me, one of the limitations is it tries to make linear a text that is non-linear. It tries to generate a story out of something that doesn't have a story. And that's fine.
Yeah.
But I think that it didn't work. Like, I think that I think Naked Lunch would have been more successful as a film, not economically. I think it probably would have, there was no way for it to make money. But I feel like it should have been more storyful, or just fucking abandon it and let it be the chaos that Naked Lunch is.
Yeah.
Instead of being a series of having a story with just like dipping its toe in 10 Burroughs stories.
Yeah, it does something that, it puts a character at the middle, right? And it puts a man at the middle. Mm-hmm. And the conspicuous thing about reading Burroughs is there's no character ever to identify with. Nobody's ever essentially human or not human. They're always morphing and becoming something else, or there's never a point of identification. If there's any identification, it's with the text itself, not with the narrator, but with the text itself, with the sort of put on and the participation in this flow where you kind of are undone in the very reading of it. You sort of flow with it. The movie kind of verges on this identification. And the character, the way Weller plays him is, he's sometimes horrified. When he's taken aback. He learns that Joan might not be human, and he's sort of surprised, where that would never be the case in the books, right? Burroughs begins from a place in which that will always have been the case, in which no one will ever really have been human. The line between the human, the reptilian, the insect, the vegetal, the cosmic forces all blur and constantly turn into each other. But Cronenberg, I think there's a lot of things he does well, and a lot of things I'm impressed with about the movie. First and foremost, the fact that he turns the narrative into a narrative about writing. It's about being able to write, and it's about the writing process without it being at all really heroic. There's none of that Hemingway crap. There's none of that romanticization.
Yeah.
It really celebrates the oddity of writing.
Does it though?
Yeah, because the first conversation is like...
I go back and forth on this with Burroughs and the movie.
Yeah, because there's like Bizarro World Kerouac and Bizarro World Ginsberg at the beginning, and they're basically having this conversation in a diner. Like Ginsberg's like, you got to keep rewriting because that's the way you get it perfect. And the Kerouac character's like, don't rewrite anything. That's the American way. And then Burroughs comes in and he sits down with them and he basically introduces this new way of doing it into the story. And that's when things start to go weird in the story.
Totally. I love that. Yeah, exactly. Right. They're having a classic writer's debate.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a great debate. You edit the free, it's a great moment for the beats. And
it is true that this text, that Burroughs in general, in a way, and the movie, don't heroize? Well, Jesus.
Lionize?
Sure.
I don't know.
Make heroic.
Render heroic.
Yes. The act of writing
Yeah.
and the writer's life. But I think that you could draw a comparison to, say, he doesn't glamorize the junkie lifestyle, but he does. Even as much horror as he inflicts on the reader about drugs, there's something glamorous about it.
Yeah, no doubt.
A lot of people get inspired to do heroin because of Burroughs. And I think that it's a similar thing with being a writer or with writers in his books, is that they're not heroized, but they are made dirty glamorous somehow.
Sure, absolutely. And there is, you're right. And that's a good way to put it. But what I love is the kind of displacement, right? All his writing is just reports. And that's what he always said his whole life, Burroughs. He goes, I always see things, right? It's the very beginning of my favorite Burroughs book is Western Lands. Is the old writers out living in a boxcar, basically, in a shanty. And he hasn't written forever, and all of a sudden he begins seeing words. He doesn't know what they are. He just starts writing them. And that's what he always said. And that's, he always wrote from his dreams. He's always kept his dream journal next to his bed. And he always saw himself as, he himself was the medium. Language is never the medium, right? And in fact, and that's something we'll talk about in a minute, right? And that's, like, for Burroughs, writing, language, in as much as we ever consider language a medium, something to convey meaning, it is a vehicle of control. And so he comes at the entire literary process, at literature, the history of literature, at language, from a completely different perspective that takes him, that completely undoes literature itself, right? Because again, there's no story. Language is not about this excavation, exploration, explication of human existence at all. It's not about human relationships. It's not about what it means to be human. He operates at the level of language itself. Right, and so he is the medium in which a kind of these forces flow through that won't be rational, that can't conform to the order of language, right? And hence he's constantly fucking with grammar. His timing and his grammar is so great, because there is grammar, there is order, but it doesn't follow periods and capitalized words and.
This might actually be a good moment to be perfunctory and explain cut-ups to our listeners who might not be familiar with Burroughs. which of you are probably better at doing such a thing?
Well, I don't know. For some reason, I developed like a disdain for the concept in the last year or two, and I'm not exactly sure why. But essentially, he would literally cut up his writing and newspaper writing and arrange it and create these new texts out of, just arranged words. And then, he lifted a lot from other people. I remember in one of his biographies, he had this note he would write, "Gets good enough to steal," in the margin of different things. And those would become pieces that he would cut out. And he would assemble basically just new writing with that. I mean, that's, as far as I can tell, that's about as far as it went, right? Like,
It's sort of auto collage, and it's something he developed with the writer Brian Geisen, writer, poet, painter, artist.
He attributes it to Geisen.
Yeah.
And they were in
But it's definitely in
Morocco.
the air because it's right around the same time that John Cage was developing strategies of chance operation into his compositions. So it's definitely like mid-century. There was a desire to disassemble linearity and break down rational thought.
Yeah. And it's the very line he gives to Ginsberg and Kerouac in the movie.
Yeah.
Right, he sits down, eradicate all rational thought.
But as I understand it, like, this is not a cut-up novel.
Nope.
It's
pre-cut up.
This is essentially like in the movie. It's displayed like Kerouac and Ginsberg show up, and there's just paper everywhere. In this disgusting hovel, and that, I guess, is pretty true to life. And so, Naked Lunch, as I've read it, is a mixture of papers that they found in this room and letters that he had written Ginsberg, and then they just came and kind of assembled it together at the end, which gives it almost like a found novel feel to me. And I always just wonder, in the endless retypings that Kerouac did and the rearrangings that Ginsberg did, like how much of it that like it would have never came to be if it was just in Burroughs' court. It was birthed by other people. And then it was only really published because, the dude from Olympia was like, "Man, this thing's obscene. We're going to get..." It's basically like a very modern take on things. Like, oh, we're going to publish this really offensive thing, and it's definitely going to catch some flack, and then we'll sell a lot of copies because it catches flack. It was almost like a growth hacking approach, very modern.
But there is actually a great scene in the movie. Again, one of the things I love about the movie is it really turns the process of writing to drama in a surprising kind of way, without like biopics that just make the writer himself heroic, make writing heroic. But when they come to Inner Zone and they find him and they're going through all his writing, Kerouac picks up a piece of paper and just starts reading it out loud, and they all kind of go quiet. And then Burroughs is like, I don't remember writing that. But they're like, this is just, and it's gorgeous. I mean, I think it's something that's consistently overlooked about Burroughs, which is that he's just a fucking great writer. I think he's it's ridiculous to say the best writer, but to me, he's the greatest writer of the 20th century. I mean, he just does things with English nobody else does, right? His turns of phrase are just outrageous.
Yeah, we were joking about that via text. I think yesterday we were saying it's like there's like pretty much a formula though, where it's like scientific term with obscure adjective preceding it. Over and over and over and over again.
Yes, it qualifies everything. It is the most adjective, adverb dense, and which is to me is part of the Burroughs cosmology.
Yeah,
right. Is that everything in Burroughs' world and the way he sees the world is qualified. Right. It is an infinitely dense plenum. Right. There is not one moment of bare space. Right? Everything is this rich, affective, drenched space. And he is so alive to all of it so that everything is read. There's never just a sense. He never just says he sits in front of the table. For all his referencing of noir, which is so bare, right? It's such a great juxtaposition because for him, nothing is everything is inflected. Everything is rich. So, from certain schools of fiction writing, right? I mean, he overqualifies. But for him, the American virus, the white man disease, and what he calls the algebra of need, right? The junk equation is fundamentally a quantitative equation, right? It's all about more, more, more that will never be satisfied. And that's one of the themes that run through all of his writing. And his writing is itself this endless qualification of everything. So it becomes this kind of anti-capitalist, anti-American revolution, that everything is this qualified, rich, And it can become fucking exhausting. I mean, reading him, right? Because there's not one just straight narrative moment.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never read the book out of order, but in reading it, like I think around the page, like the 100-page mark to like 150, like 1 to 150, it starts to get exhausting to read, or at least it does for me. And like if you read a lot of reviews of it, people are like, a lot of people throw in the towel around at page 100. I don't know if that's because people have adopted the Oprah rule, where she's like, I toss a book at 100 pages or whatever. But I wonder how that experience would change if you just started at page 100, because I feel like the stuff in the intro is more exciting in a way. Like it definitely, it starts off with the classic druggy quest, like Scott Sturgeon from Leftover Crack, that crusty punk band. He always talks about how like one of the best things about drugs is it gives you a daily adventure to go on. Like you have to go, like you and your friends go on basically like this D&D adventure every day to get the money if you don't have it, and then go score the drugs, and then something interesting happens. So you have like this kind of little 3-act play that plays out in the process of scoring. And that's really what the first 40 or so pages are, like especially like jumping on the turnstile and running into the New York. It has like an action feel to it. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know if you guys feel the same way. Like that first 40 pages are my favorite.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, I also feel like I found reading it for this episode, it was my third time, and I found myself going through it quite quickly. In a way, it felt like reading Moby Dick or 120 Days of Sodom, where there's this way shorter, obviously. It is not that marathon, but it's a similar marathon where you are inundated with a relentlessness. And it's a relentlessness of detail, but it's also a relentlessness of horror. It's a relentlessness of adjectives. It's a relentlessness of junk, sick, whore, toothless. Jism.
Lots of jism.
And so it becomes like Moby Dick and 120 Days of Sodom, at least those are the ones that came to mind first, where it becomes this texture of this world that if you skipped, let's say in Moby Dick, if you skip 400 pages, you're fine. 120 Days of Sodom, if you read the first 50 and the last 50, you've read the book. But you haven't had the experience of going through it, which is absolutely what Moby Dick is, what 120 Days of Sodom is. You have to go on that horrifying, relentless journey, page by page by page. And the fact that you can start anywhere in Naked Lunch sort of adds to that, I feel.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's funny that you mentioned the Sodom one is great. I hadn't thought of that. I thought about Moby Dick in relationship to this book.
It reminds me of like just the white chapter, but about junk instead of the color white.
Right. Yeah. Melville, I think. Burroughs is closer to Melville than he is to any of the beats or Kerouac or anything like that, with that relentlessness, with that. It's post-human, right? I mean, it's I don't know if it's post-human, it's non-human, right?
The humor,
all these
too.
Other forces. Yeah.
Yeah, like there's all that really weird humor. And then Melville and Moby Dick, there's like explicit transhuman stuff that goes on.
Yeah.
Like the captain, the fact that he puts his peg leg into the ship and he kind of like fuses with it. Completely. And so he becomes like this weird whale hunting cyborg.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I completely agree. Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned it, because reading it this time, for some reason, Moby Dick kept coming back to me.
Yeah.
And Melville.
What other, in approaching this, do you find as being a precedent for what he was doing? Because I'm not the most read person in the world, but when I approach Burroughs, I have no idea where this fucking came from. It confounds the shit out of me. How did we get here? Like, I can look at the beats, but I don't think any of the other beats really are doing what he's doing.
He's not really a beat. I mean, he's up to his own thing.
Right. Totally. And like, there are definitely these weird anomalies through literature's history, like Maldor or something, just something fucking frenetic and weird and out there. But I don't know if that's necessary, if he necessarily read that. So what, and also, speaking of horror, it is so, for the years that he wrote that, I am shocked that anybody went that far at that year with depravity, just so on the table with it all.
Yeah, well, he had already done, we had a quick exchange just online about the Yage letters, right, which is before this, right? So the story of this and the story of the movie, in a way, Burroughs wasn't a writer. He was just a guy, right? But he's like holding forth up on the Upper West Side to these young Columbia kids. And he's just this old pederast, you know.
I think Chad, you referred to him as a Trustafarian.
Yeah.
At some
Yeah,
point,
and he had his
fair.
little trust fund, and it wasn't a lot, but it kept him. He didn't really have to work.
Yeah, it was just enough to keep the day job away. It wasn't enough to like live in opulence,
Exactly.
you know. And in some ways, it wasn't much more than like Cormac McCarthy with his meager stipend he gets from the arts, you know, except for it came from this adding machine, which I think probably always like created like a tension in him a little bit, like he was, you know, unmanly for not earning his own way, but also didn't care about that too.
Yeah.
But I think like where the writing comes from is like, you know, he comes out of was Harvard, right?
Oh yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So he comes out of Harvard with like a canonical English lit background, you know, like no, like I'm trying to shake it up, man. I'm going to read just only women or whatever. He gets like the canon.
Yeah.
And then he gets living amongst drug addicts and reading pulp stuff. And then he's kind of the first to put those two worlds together. It's like, you know, like you see it in art, like the lowbrow, highbrow. Boom. Like it's right there and emerges from him.
It's like Tarantino.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah. I know he's obsessed with Denton Welch, who I'd never heard of except from Burroughs. And I went back and read it. It's great to read. And you see flickers, but he's just on his own fucking plane. And I can't help but think that his experiences with Yage and with drugs are what set him loose, right? That he really began to see things and understand things in a way that still I don't think we've caught up with. I mean, I think he's the 21st century thinker.
Yeah. And there's that line in the movie, and I think it's probably in the book too somewhere, but it's like, it's time to discuss your philosophy of drug use as it relates to artistic endeavor. And in the movie, you know, the different typewriters, I think one way of reading, like, you know, the different creatures, or like they're different drugs that different people are using. Because he says like, oh, this didn't work for me, but this one does, or this one's too demanding. So like Burroughs' typewriter is like a junk typewriter. And then the Paul Knowles character, I mean, who knows? Could be like opium or whatever. Right. And then when they switch each other's typewriters up, it doesn't really work for them because they have different drug chemistries. And they even in the film talk about like, oh, this isn't really your chemistry. And when the Joan character is like shooting up the bug and she's like, oh, this is a literary high, this is a Kafka high, it makes you feel like an insect. And he's not really that interested in it. It's not like in some other movies where there's a glamorous drug scene and somebody's like, oh, I went in on that, like Boogie Nights or something, you know.
Yeah, that's a great call. You know, it's funny because I like the fact that the machine inflects the writing, right? He can't work with certain machines. And to me, that I read that just as about the fact that there is no such thing just as language or writing. There's always a medium. But you're absolutely right. Like part of that is definitely what you're ingesting. You know, and I think it's funny that I happen to have been reading over the past couple of weeks is the Terence McKenna Food of the Gods. And I didn't, I always knew his argument, but I didn't realize he quotes Burroughs relentlessly.
Yeah.
You know, he gets a lot of his model of drugs and explaining drugs from Burroughs. He quotes Naked Lunch quite a bit in the Algebra of Need, in that whole concept, right, of heroin is need and when he's bashing heroin, McKenna.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's the Yage. I mean, what's funny is that for Burroughs, heroin is the basest thing. It's funny that it gets glamorized, right? Because for him, it's the most depraved. It is the virus of what McKenna calls dominator culture, right? It's pure need, right? It's pure quantity, you know, where Yage was this whole other thing.
Yeah, I was thinking about like McKenna's dominator culture, and another part of our exchange. I was talking about this book, The Chalice and the Blade, that McKenna loved, and that book's argument is essentially like, you know, back when it was a matriarchy, everything was swell, and then these dominator cultures came in, and they're purely patriarchal. But Burroughs kind of reverses that, where he talks about how matriarchies are these, you know, nightmarish machines of homogenization because women want to keep everything sterile, and the freest thing is a homosexual agent that doesn't realize he's an agent. Like it's just this weird, like you wonder like what's his take on this dominator culture thing. Yeah. It's like he's resisting control obviously, but he's seeing it come from a different place. Yeah.
I mean, he's much less didactic, right? McKenna's book is one of the hilarious things about it is how didactic it is, right? It really is a polemic, you know, because it's a great ethnobotanical take, right? I mean, it's fucking brilliant, but then he's got this very clean argument about matriarchy and the dominator culture, where Burroughs is much stranger. And he's definitely operating, he goes further than McKenna in that he truly is looking at these forces, magical forces, cosmic forces. He really believes in possession. It's another interesting choice Cronenberg made to talk about writing and possession and pick up those two themes of Burroughs. Of all the things he could have talked about, he chose some of the weirder things to talk about in a movie. And I kind of respect that about a movie that I don't think is very good.
Well, the film is like, it's almost like MCU, like Marvel movie filled with Easter eggs. Like if you know a lot about Burroughs, there's so much shit in it that is really just deep cuts. Like the character Kiki is one of his lovers that was palling around with him in Tangiers and ended up getting murdered by like some other dude. Yeah. And that character's there. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But he does have a consistent theme of the movie. I was surprised. I'd seen it before, but I hadn't seen it in a long time. How consistent the theme is about possession. And he comes back to that introduction. I think it doesn't come till later, actually, right? Where he goes back and rewrites the introduction, maybe to Queer, where he says, Burroughs says, I'd come to the horrifying truth that I only became a writer because I killed Joan. It's the only time he'd mentioned her death ever, and it came really late in his life. And I think that's this kind of narrative nugget that Cronenberg picks up on and tries to kind of create a whole movie around.
Well, but it is kind of interesting the way it plays out in the movie, because it's hard not to see hovering over Burroughs' career and life that the way misogyny sort of is always somehow present, not always overt, but it's really hard not to sort of go like, yeah, this wasn't a symbolic act. It was symbolic and literal both. Yeah. And the movie literalizes the metaphor, but it kind of was real. Yeah. Which is really fucking dark.
Really dark.
Yeah, with her shooting, like the movie attempts to, I think, mirror some of the repetition of the novel. Like there's a lot of lines that are repeated over and over again. Yeah. And then you get, the choice of the actress playing Joan and Jane, and it's unexplained, has like a feel of like a cut up novel. Yeah. And then, he shoots her at the beginning and then he shoots her at the end to get into Annexia. It's not quite, I don't think there's ever been in his books like that clean of a parallel. Yeah. Like nothing like recycles itself back to a point like that. So that was something in the film that was a little weird to me.
A little forced, right? Yeah. As I was saying, we were talking about McKenna versus Burroughs, the dominator culture. Burroughs, his cosmology is much stranger. Yeah. And it's not so clean cut.
And then McKenna has like this like hardcore teleology to his thing. So, he literally, it was time wave zero, right? Like he thought like everything was going to click over in 2012. So a lot of the end of the world 2012, not hysteria, but like, interest comes from McKenna. And, he developed this really like quack math structure to kind of support his ideas. And, if people who just only listen to McKenna are like, oh my God, he sounds so amazing. But you can go listen to him in conversation with physicists and they're like, man, this isn't even math. Like, what are you talking about? And what's interesting about McKenna, he sort of like was very put out by that. And he was like, whoa, is any of it salvageable? And they're like, no, man, this is terrible. And you would think a dude like him would sort of go the Burroughs route and be like, look, man, this is metaphor. Language is an interesting thing that's happening. But he sort of like, I don't know, it almost like tore him apart a little bit that like his theory was so dismissed. Whereas I can't imagine Burroughs being upset that his theories were dismissed. Yeah. It almost like emboldened him probably.
Yeah, completely.
Which is definitely interesting in his writings and in his life that he was always seeking. And there often feels when you approach Burroughs as, let's say, an interview subject, that there's an argument being made, but there kind of never is.
Yes,
like he has some really hard positions, but they're almost parodic in some instances. His things about masculinity, for example, he's constantly taking these hard positions that everything in his work undermines constantly. So there's never a fixed position in anything he does or says, which I think is interesting because it's this precarious way of living. I don't want to say living your truth, but I would say maybe living your art. Mm-hmm. The way his work exists, if it does put forth let's not say an argument, but a style, or style as argument or argument as style, that he was also sort of living that, because he was so, we can sort of look at him as that he's William S. Burroughs, but he was always sort of on the move. He was constantly dodging it. And I find it very, being a little random, but I find it really fascinating that all of his interest in control systems, he's obsessed with control, but also simultaneously always not even allowing language to be controlled.
Yeah, but I love that, because I think that is, in fact, his argument, right? Which is that the world is not just flux and not just, it's a plenum, right? So it's full, there's no empty space. So we're constantly bumping up against each other. But unlike, let's say, Leibniz and Deleuze's reading of Leibniz, right? It's this Baroque harmony. Everything has its place. There's no dissonance, right? That's the argument of the Baroque. Everything has its place, right? There'll always be another note can always squeeze in between the two. The modern condition is such that two things vie for the same place and, in fact, occupy the same place at the same time, right? So there's dissonance, right? As opposed, so you go from Bach to Mahler, right? You begin to get that kind of drone, that kind of skid. And for Burroughs, there's conflict constantly, right? So the movie portrays him, and it walks a kind of a funny line. And one thing that's often attributed to Burroughs is paranoia, when in fact he's not paranoid at all, right? It is conflict and all-out perpetual state of war is the condition of life. Forces both at the human and the cosmic and the biological and the special and the planetary are constantly vying and colliding. It's not, there is no fundamental harmony. Right? And so it's not paranoia. You have to keep moving, right? And so he is a man of gimmicks. It's why he believes in guns, right? And it's why he has this kind of ethics, because he's profoundly ethical, right? That's really, in many ways, what his writing is.
Well, he has a code.
Ethics. Yeah.
Right. Like, that's the thing that I like about him is he has the kind of code that like a character like Jules in Pulp Fiction would have. It's not moral to the standards of to the squares, but there's, he definitely has things that he does because of certain reasons. Like it's like people in prison, like convicts, are extremely regulated by their own rules, even more so in some cases than the state, which I think it's just interesting that the rest of the beats don't really have that sort of feel. Like they're trying to take away codes the whole time, and he's like almost building up a code, because he realizes like what's beyond all of us is way worse. It has like an H.P. Lovecraft quality to it, I think. Yeah.
He talks, one of my favorite moments, it comes back in, it's one of the key themes in Place of Dead Roads. As a quick aside, I think Naked Lunch is one of his worst books. It's one of my least favorite books of his. I think he hits his stride. We talked about offline was his last trilogy. At the end of his life, he really got in a rhythm where he began to use the cut up as an idea as opposed to a practice. And so the writing is just much more sophisticated. And he understands juxtaposition without having to create this nonsense, this kind of unreadability. But, he talks about the Johnson and the code of the Johnson. The Johnson was this sort of the grifter, the everyday con man who had this kind of code. And it comes down to, and he talks about what a Johnson is, and a Johnson is someone who minds their own fucking business, but they're not going to throw you under the bus. So he talks about, when he's out of his hotel room and the cops raided his room, he's on his way back to the hotel and the bellhop tells him the cops are upstairs. This guy didn't have to do that. Or he's busted, he's thrown in jail, and one of the cops gives him a joint. Like it's a Johnson. Didn't have to do it. But fundamentally, mind your own fucking business.
Yeah.
And that's what he liked about Mexico, where you could walk down the street holding hands with a young boy. And I know this can get me all kinds of trouble for saying this, but I don't think they were underage boys per se. I don't know. I'm going to leave that aside. But you could walk down the street holding hands with a boy, with another man, let's say. But he also always went strapped, right? And I know his gun etiquette might not have been up to snuff.
The worst.
But he always had a gun with him. He was terrible. He accidentally killed his fucking wife. I mean, he clearly doesn't know how to handle a gun, but he's obsessed with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think, especially this Bay Area culture, the idea of like gun, people who have guns are just out there wild hillbillying it up. It's like, man, like firearm culture is incredibly regulated and almost, as you would imagine, sort of conservative. And Burroughs like violates all those rules. Like on our Instagram, I put like a couple pictures, but you cannot find a picture of him with a gun with his finger off the trigger. Like
Which I kind of love, to be honest.
I mean, for him, yeah, I do kind of love it. But it's, I don't know, there's just something weird about it. And then the types of firearms he was interested in were, this is actually a super weird Easter egg. Like when, in the film, after he shoots his wife, when he tries to pawn the pistol, the guy's like, oh, this is communist trash. He liked these weird caliber, shitty pistols. And I was like, wow, what a really like deep cut to include in the film that probably like most people are going to miss. But yeah, all these pictures of him, it's weird. And then his like visual art was so dependent on firearms and just terrible. I mean, it's really just universally considered terrible, but not so much different than our friend that did Shoot. What's his name?
Chris Burden,
the worst artist of all time. Right. But like, like you're shooting a can of paint into a canvas. I mean,
but again, those are a failure, but I do love, again, his relentless displacement of the artist as master. Mm-hmm. Right. And it goes back to the cut up. I mean, obviously the shotgun thing is a kind of uninteresting way to do it. Yeah. But it makes it super explicit. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's helpful as a kind of, didactic figure to use. Yeah. His drawings are actually kind of great. I tried to buy a print of his recently online because when he actually uses his hand, he's pretty good. But I love that there's a great picture of him where he's standing in front. He has got the shotgun and his two paintings behind him. Mm-hmm. And I love that that's his tool. Right? That he's not showing bravado right there. That's his tool, right? It's like showing Pollock with his paints. Same with his writing. When asked, what do you use to write? He's like, I always have my whatever brand of typewriter he used and a pair of scissors. I love that. Just a throwaway. He doesn't explain why he needs the scissors, but he always has a pair of scissors. And there's just something fantastic of just jamming up. And totally, not just jamming and then displacing and then recreating a whole other practice of writing and what it means and a relationship to writing and to words that is so idiosyncratic and yet so thorough and then practiced. And the guy was incredibly prolific. He's a ton of writing, and I don't know, there's something just kills me about that. So anyway, we were talking about his ethics, right? And so you're talking about the fact that he's always moving, always has these different positions, but that is his position. So his ethics was, it's a code, but his code is a code of difference, right? If morality is an external set of dictums, right? Ethics is always emergent, and his is always emergent. It's basically mind your own fucking business, right? Which is my grandfather. My mom put that on a shirt for my grandfather. Just mind your own fucking business. But it was one of Burroughs' refrains. And, he kept talking about people sticking their nose. He always hated the moral state, the moral housewives, moral culture. Just let me fuck and let me do my drugs and leave me the hell alone. But at the same time, I'm not going to go kill and rape and just because you get rid of some things doesn't mean you inaugurate chaos. Yeah,
it's a weird natural libertarian position that he has, and his whole Code of the Johnson thing, massively influential on my own outlook on politics, and and even the way he approaches firearms, it's totally apolitical. He's not trying to refresh the tree of liberty with the blood of the infidel or whatever the fuck. It's a thing he likes. And that's enough of a justification.
But he does believe, as one of his famous lines, right, is every time there's a shooting, the first thing they do is want to take our guns. Mm-hmm. And he's like, and it's funny, and again, in San Francisco and liberal culture out here, right, we're supposed to be all anti-gun. And Burroughs comes from a very different school, right, where it's not the NRA. He's definitely not belonging to the NRA, but he sure as hell ain't a liberal, right? So, and of course, in American discourse, there's no space for someone like that.
Well, I think it's also interesting reading this right now. I've found, especially in San Francisco and in the circles I run in, that reactionary leftist culture, I feel it's anecdotal. It's not a fact. It's getting worse. Yeah. I sort of had hoped it was getting better, but I feel like it's getting worse. I feel like almost daily I encounter some instance that's a little too close to my world, where someone's being called out publicly for something that is completely irrelevant or a misunderstanding and is being leveraged for some kind of abstract power that is also meaningless. And it was really interesting reading this book in particular because every page there is something that is completely objectionable to leftist Twitter.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's some turn of phrase, there's some objectification of some person or their body that is completely unacceptable in public discourse right now. And it was maybe 60 years ago to the day that this was published.
Yeah.
And it feels like this book is almost more, I hate the word taboo, but more controversial or something like that. The contents of it are possibly more controversial right now than they might have been in 50-fucking-9.
Totally.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do is go find some like classic thing that, was previously loved, whether it be like this book or, Streetcar Named Desire or something like that, and go look at the Amazon reviews and go and look at the 1-star reviews. It's fucking great. And in this book particular, I found a YouTube channel. There's this whole like booktube phenomenon where people just review books, which is terrible. And this one girl, she's like a queer book reviewer. And she was like not having this at all. I'm like, man, it's kind of weird because like if it wasn't for this book, there'd probably be no queer YouTube book reviews, But what's interesting is like when it came time for the state to squash this book, the state didn't. The state's like, yeah, this is fine. It has artistic merit. But it was the people in these weird little circles that were against it more than anything else.
That's not surprising.
The maxim that nothing is true, everything is permitted, which is that his?
It's Hassani Sabah.
But and who is that?
He's the man of the mountain. So he was a...
Is it a real person?
Yeah. It's like,
Sort of.
I honestly always assumed that... I always thought he was a fiction of Burroughs's. I'm sorry to say.
No, it's funny. I kind of became obsessed because not obsessed. I poked around a little online years ago because I was like, I was like, did he just make this guy up? But he started showing up in other people's books. He shows up in Nietzsche. When I was I was rereading
Then it must be true.
Genealogy, and he quotes Hassani Sabah. Nothing's true, everything's permitted. Which I was like, what the fuck? He was a Muslim who was defending, trying to convert people and fighting up against the Christians, and they conquered up in the mountain in Alamut, some mountain in like Syria or wherever the fuck in the Middle East, and they were known for using different methods to get people to convert. He got all his lackeys would smoke hash, and then they would send out anyone who wouldn't convert. They would send out assassins that come supposedly from Hashashin, because they're all getting high and then going out and slitting the throats of. For Nietzsche, what Hassan Najibah was a resistor to Christian hegemony. Right? Of course, he was a Muslim, but. It's just still one God. But for Nietzsche, he was at least a figure, at least proffering nothing is true.
Yeah.
Everything's burned in the face of Christian bullshit.
Yeah, he was like an Islamic mountain pirate.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
That's brilliant.
Totally
like that.
A really cool character. And it's interesting how like that myth has popped up over and over again. There's something that comes up on our show from time to time is the vampire role-playing game, the old tabletop Vampire the Masquerade. There's an entire clan of vampires in that mythology that descends from him.
Oh wow!
It's interesting. And that game is so weirdly influential because it sort of took a lot of this old beat weirdness and revived it into the 90s for like a modern gothy nerd crowd. Yeah, it's really how I know about a lot of the stuff I know about is from that weird little group.
That's great.
Yeah.
The reason why I brought up that turn of phrase in particular that comes up through Burroughs is that I feel like we're in this era where everything is true and nothing is permitted. Yeah. Not to be overly dramatic that like, oh my God, nothing is permitted. Obviously, I have plenty of freedom, but there's an increased movement of which I was just referring to, where it's like everything you feel is a fact, your feelings are facts, and you're not allowed to do anything because the will of one supersedes minding your own fucking business,
Yeah.
which is bananas to me.
Yeah.
Another funny thing about that phrase, nothing is true, everything is permitted, is try Googling it now and running into Burroughs or Geisen. You can't, because Assassin's Creed, the video game, uses it. And basically the first 8 pages of your Google search attributes that phrase to an Assassin's Creed module.
Oh, wow, that's hilarious.
It's super interesting. It's just gone. No one, unless you're of a certain age and into this weird shit, is ever going to run into that again.
Yeah, that's really funny. I kind of love that. I love that the movie opens with it too. It's the very first thing that comes up on the screen.
Yep.
And it is just such a great phrase, right? And I love that it shows up. It's in Nietzsche and it shows up in Burroughs, right? It's just like these moments that are, and both Burroughs and Nietzsche both offer this kind of post-moral ethics. That's really what they're about. That's, of course, what Nietzsche's all about. That's all his philosophy is about giving you an ethics that's not moral.
Yeah.
But Burroughs too, I think Burroughs is really about an ethics, right? And that he's constantly looking at the horrible shit that's perpetrated in the name of humanity, in the name of morality, in the name of all these things, in the terrible way people treat each other. And instead, he does have this kind of, I guess we call it some kind of libertarian, but he would never have a dogma, right? It's just just mind your own fucking business, but if the guy's drowning, lend him a hand. I mean, don't be an asshole, right?
Yeah,
it's such a beautiful ethics.
We were talking about Parks and Recs before this, and I was thinking about how Burroughs is sort of like the Ron Swanson of the beats in some weird ways. Just kind of knows what to do, is armed.
Yeah.
Don't talk to me, mind your own business is the ethic.
Yeah, that's kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. It's not totally on the nose.
The thing there's a couple of things thinking about the book and the movie and him as this character is, and there's something that really kind of most bugged me from the first time I saw it and again this time is Burroughs is fucking gay. There's not sexual ambivalence. He's super queeny, right? And that's one thing I love about his writing, right? Is these things. He always says things like dearie. He loves putting on, one of his shticks is putting on the old queen shtick. And Peter Weller plays it so masculine. And the whole seduction, his approach about his sexual ambivalence, where he has no sexual ambivalence.
It's weird too, because Peter Weller is like a Burroughs scholar. He fucking loves him.
Yeah.
You go watch, there's an endless amount of YouTube videos of him talking about him, and there's even one where he just gets super Malibu woke, and he's talking about, he's like, you have to think about Stonewall. He's giving this speech, and he's just going on about and this is the heart of queerness, and you're like, okay, RoboCop, preach, but it is weird that the whole time he's sort of there's nothing gay about Peter Weller's Burroughs at all.
Just the opposite. In fact, feels like when he goes gay in the movie, it almost feels like that, right? Where Burroughs, I mean, he goes back through all his young childhood sexual experiences. It's always been about dick, and for him, really young dick. I mean, he's obsessed with his own childhood sexuality. And it recurs throughout in the smell of young jizz and the smell of young bodies. And there's never any doubt. He never, ever once in his writing sexualizes women. Not once.
Yeah,
There's
you
not
can't find it
one
anywhere.
moment where he expresses desire for a woman. And I thought the movie, I don't know why, it feels like Cronenberg's decision. It was a weird decision that kind of bummed me out. I remember the time being kind of offended.
Well, it's 1991. You know what I mean? I'd imagine there was probably some sort of studio pressure to not have your male lead, who at the time is RoboCop. You're not gonna have him do that. I mean, it's interesting how times change. There's a scene in the new Avengers movie, and there's no spoilers here, but there's a character talking about basically getting his life back together in an AA sort of circle. Just matter of factly, the guy's talking about it being a man that he's going on a date with, and the movie makes no. It is flowing as any other conversation, right? As if we would have that conversation in San Francisco today.
Right.
And it's so odd to think it stood out to me, and it was weird to me that it stood out to me because it's a major movie, but it's normalized. But this movie that's all about weirdness doesn't normalize it. But it's it's 1991.
Yeah, that was the only thing I could think too, because it's disappointing. And I remember when it came out, I was curious how they portray it, because Burroughs owns, his own. He does have a lot of self-loathing around. He's incredible, like dysmorphia. Right? I mean, that comes out through all his writing, and you see him physically, where Peter Weller and Cronenberg play him as this cool. What's the word? Gumshoe or whatever, right? Is that the right word?
Yeah.
Where in fact Burroughs is incredibly uncomfortable in his body. He never stops twitching. He's got that much stranger voice. He's not a cool cat in many ways, right? He's a nervous kind of dude filled with all kinds of self-loathing around his sexuality, but explicitly, relentlessly homosexual. Mm-hmm. And I thought the movie is one of the bigger disappointments to me is that I wanted the character to be a little twitchier, not just so cool, and gayer.
Julian Sands kind of rocks it though, as the Eve Clokey character. I mean, he is like very like a really great measured expatriate queerness. Like I think he's great in the movie.
Yeah. And there's the other guy, the guy, what's his name? The guy with the German accent, Franz, right? Who comes up in all these Cronenberg movies. I forgot the actor's name. Has this weird sense of his sexuality too, right? That there is everyone else in the movie, even what's his name, who plays the Paul Bowles character, right? Has this kind of ambisexuality. Where for some reason Burroughs is played as the straightest character in it. Right? Ginsberg propositions him at some point. Right? Because he walks in and Kerouac is fucking Jane. And Ginsberg's like, why don't we join him? And Burroughs sort of steps back. When in fact, Burroughs was in love with Ginsberg his whole life, and they did have an affair.
Well, he does invite him to come live with him in Interzone for a while at the very end. Like Burroughs invites Ginsberg, and he kind of goes like, "No, you'll write the book and send it in." Right. See, and it's just like a weird little moment.
Right.
In the rest of it, I don't remember Anexia being in any of his other.
Nope.
I mean, it's just like a weird Cronenbergian.
That was my take too. Yeah. I didn't know it either. Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't think of any previous symbolism or what even he was talking about. Or
I had the same reaction. Yeah, I don't know. Felt again they were looking for some kind of finale, somewhere to close it. That whole cycle, the repetition, and felt a little forced to me. I mean, again, there are things I did like about the movie. I mean, I like that it's really boring.
Funny you should say that.
Yeah.
I rewatched it once I think I watched it at 1.5 or double speed. Yeah. And it was still really slow.
It's really, really boring. And there's something kind of great about that, right? Because, I mean, I haven't seen any of these Avenger movies, but they're just so relentless, right? Just everything's become the quick cut and everything. And Cronenberg, I think, is great. Lets the movie be kind of just boring.
Well, it's like, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think Cronenberg, especially in his early movies, they're all really messy. Yeah. They're all deeply flawed. They're super interesting and memorable.
And that is socialism at work with the Canadian film system, letting you make a
You think?
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'm being kind of jokey about it.
But you're joking about my people, so fucking step up and make the right argument.
Well, what I'm saying is, like, there's less of a... They don't have to, like, 10x their money coming out of it. You know what I mean? So it does get to be messy.
Right.
It's going to get made either way. They got the money to make it. He's going to be able to make as many Canadian films as he wants, so he gets to do what he wants.
Although I don't know that this movie was made with Canadian money, was it?
Yeah.
It was?
Yeah. For a moment, it was going to not be because they wanted to go film part of it in Iran or Iraq or something like that, and the Iraq War happens, and it's all Canadian, so it becomes another Canadian film movie.
So there was like $2.5 million or something for the whole movie?
I think that's what it made. It cost like $16 million, and it made like $2 million.
Oops.
Yeah.
But again, in Canada.
It's a kind of unwatchable movie, and that's what I almost kind of like about it. My favorite thing about it is that it's kind of terrible and kind of hard to watch.
Well, it's so different than what you see now that like you don't really get that mid-range movie anymore. Like nobody can make it. And I was like, oh, this is like watching a fairly well-produced indie film, and I was like, oh, I haven't felt like this watching a movie in a really long time. Like wouldn't even know how it ended. Like I'm watching it, I'm like, I actually don't know where this movie's going. Like, which is kind of a pleasure.
Yeah, I had the exact same reaction. I was just like, it felt old. Felt like back in the day when people made movies like this, and there was a whole thriving indie culture. We called them indies.
Yeah.
and it was intentional, but it has like a studio cleanness to it. Like it could almost be like a Metro Golden Mayer movie. Like
Oh, you're
like,
right.
Like all the we were talking about this on the walk over here. Like all the costumes, except for when he's in dirt, they're all super clean. Like it could have been the Madonna Dick Tracy movie.
So I think you did that on purpose, right? Because it's also the music, right? It feels like an MGM, right? I mean, it obviously takes a lot from Casablanca, right? His vision of Inner Zone is very Casablanca.
What did you think of the music?
Yeah, I just kept being. I mean, there's two music scores. One is the jazz, and the other is the sort of big MGM studio schmaltz music.
Yeah.
I thought the jazz felt like an easy kind of cop out. Huh. Although I kind of got it, right? It kind of made sense. It kind of, it's such a beatnik parody now, right? But I liked that it was more free jazz. It wasn't cool jazz, right? That it verges. I think they could have gone either more chaotic. I don't know. I'm curious what you think.
I always really liked it. I always felt that the music as a score is better than this movie is as a movie.
Okay. Yeah.
It succeeds on the terms it sets for itself more than the movie does.
It gave it like this movie. The movie I kept comparing it to in my head is Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Like that's the movie it most reminded me of because there's the hard-boiled element that's so clean, and then there's the chaos, right? Nice. Like so, like in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the chaos is Toontown, and then it's Inner Zone with all the bugs and mucus monsters and all that stuff. And when I was thinking about this movie, how it could be made, like if I was going to make this movie, if I was going to make Cronenberg's Naked Lunch today, like I would probably animate the Interzone parts and just make it break out like Cool World or something like that.
I wonder. It's two things that are funny. One is one of my lines always was that Burroughs to me is the Looney Tunes of literature. So it's funny that you made that comparison, right? That kind of speed and his humor and his timing is very Looney Tunes, right? It's this hyperkinetic, super fast. There tends to be this kind of gag punchline at the end that's a little crass, Then Benway throws the knife. They pirouettes through the room to do the surgery, and the knife splatters across the room, and the guy sits up and says something like this. It has a kind of very Chuck Jones humor to it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the other thing I was thinking is why a narrative at all? Why not just this decentered, psychedelic, more animated experience? Like why? It would be a very different thing, right? Much harder to make.
Well, Chad, you had a comparison to make.
You're gonna have to prompt me because I can't remember.
The Aristocats.
Oh yeah, so this
the Aristocrats.
So I mean the Aristocrats joke, and we talked about this on the Serbian film, which is like at a certain point, all of the extremism, if it's unmoored by a plot or whatever you're expecting, it just gets sillier and sillier and sillier. And Naked Lunch at some point, I mean, it's all meant to be funny. It is hilarious. And you could imagine Burroughs' Aristocrats. And I think the film kind of does a decent job of portraying. He does have some monologues that are straight from the book, and he's doing them as like speeches to entertain in the movie. And it's funny to see how the other characters, it falls really flat in the room. But that's not really what his friends reported. His friends all talked about how, like, man, if you loved Naked Lunch, you would have loved talking to him at dinner, which would have been, I mean, you can't really experience that.
Yeah. And it's funny when they actually talk about, because that bit that's from Queer, right? That's one of the best, like one of my favorite Burroughs. And I always like that about the movies when he's talking to Julian Sands over dinner. He talks about, I remember, I seared in my head that I was homosexual, and I remember getting advice from the old queen, and they turn her piles into hemorrhoids in the movie. They get caught in the wheel. And one of my favorite lines ever in Burroughs was, and I couldn't believe they used it in the movie, and it made a horrible schlupping sound, which is to me sums up Burroughs, right? Just the viscosity. His world is super viscous and ooey, but that humor and that's a great Looney Tunes moment, that schlupping sound. In the scene, it kind of falls really flat, right? But then later, everyone's like, oh, you were a big hit. Everyone is cracking up. But they didn't portray that.
Yeah, I mean, you can almost see, like, for example, in Goodfellas, when they're joking and laughing, they start actually laughing because it's really funny. Like, you want that scene to break out and be funny because it's the whole time. It's like people didn't hang around with each other, smoke pot, and do Benzedrine to be fucking bummed. They did it to party and have a good time. And I feel like that's often missing from every single biopic or whatever. Like people don't look like they're having fun.
That's
They
a
just
great-
look like
that's a great call.
they're like laying around, and
Yeah.
it's not like late 90s Cobain heroin chic. You know, it's like that's what the cool kids did. They listened to this goofy jazz music
Yeah.
and got hopped up on whatever.
Yeah, there's no real pleasure. He's constantly put upon.
Yeah.
Right? He's constantly, even the sex, everything is unpleasant.
Yeah, it made me think of that Bill Hicks routine where he talks about like no one ever talks about their positive drug stories. You know, it's always like man takes LSD and jumps off roof. Nobody ever says, oh, man takes LSD and thinks about the secret of the universe and reimagines his life and becomes
That's
a better
great.
person. And
That's awesome.
it like that's kind of like that happens with drugs. People's lives get better with drugs sometimes.
Yeah, most of the time. Most of the time.
Most of the time.
Yeah, of course.
What?
Most of the time, drugs are good, right?
I will say that my life was dramatically improved by drug use.
Oh my God, everything I know. Yeah, I mean, no question about it. I mean, the amount of drugs that I encounter in my life and I come across with other people, we're all better for it. I don't see any problems. Occasionally things go off the rails, but things go off the rails with a job, with a wife, with all kinds of things, right?
Yeah,
So,
Joe Rogan says like losers are going to fuck themselves up with cheeseburgers and scratcher
Yeah,
tickets.
exactly.
You know, no matter
never
what.
Never blame the drug. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's get back in the film a little bit. And this being a horror podcast, the horror elements of this movie are largely special effects based.
Yeah.
And the special effects, I think the look of these typewriters and stuff, they're such interesting ideas, and having like the talking asshole but not explain it, and the bug and the typewriter thing. But everything looks rubber on film, man. It is really not well executed. But the creature concept designs, I think, are really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's all super clunky, but I think it's really imaginative. I don't know, for the time, if it was that bad, especially for the amount of money that this movie had, that if you were going to point a camera at a monster and hold it there pretty well lit for a long period of time, at that time, anything is going to kind of fall apart and just look like foam rubber.
It's no worse than Star Wars was.
That's kind of what I mean.
And you talked about the well lit. It's weird how well lit all these creatures are.
See, I love them. I think they're much more visceral, and I get a much more palpable sense of them than anything from Star Wars. I think the mugwump is fantastic.
Yeah.
I think just one thing that comes all through Burroughs is his sense of the universe is never kinetic. It's never that clean. It's always oozing. Everything is shit, blood, plasm, ooze. All bodies are constantly kind of these grotesque, dehiscent creatures. And I think they nail that with especially the mugwump. That kind of you could feel and almost smell its skin. If it would touch them, it wouldn't be. It has a kind of viscosity. You don't even know what that fluid is.
Yeah, it's like E.T. and a scrotum mixed together.
Yeah, I think much more intense and much more palpable, right, visceral than E.T. E.T. felt like a Muppet.
Yeah. And the mugwumps, like I watched some interviews with the creature creators, and it's based on Burroughs. They were like, let's try to make it look like Burroughs, make it sound like Burroughs a little bit. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting about the design of the creature is it's a lot thinner than a lot of monster effects were at the time. So that was difficult for them, was to make this creature work. Yeah. Did you see that Dennis Miller clip I sent you?
I didn't.
So there's from Dennis Miller's like early 90s TV show, which was terrible then. He has the special effects creators come on his show and kind of show off all the creatures. And it's just such a weird piece. Like part of the experience of watching this movie and reading this book was like in a weird cut up sort of way, like watching all these YouTube clips to go along with it. And it's created this weird tapestry that probably I wouldn't have experienced when I first read the book. But yeah, Dennis Miller like, yeah, of course I know Burroughs, but what's this thing? It's like, dude, it's a giant centipede. If you knew Burroughs, you would know what the fuck that is. It's just.
I think the horror element is the thing that makes this movie not actually a movie of Naked Lunch. Because to me, Naked Lunch, if you were to, and we could literally do this right now, if you picked a random page right now and read any paragraph, it would be a horror.
Yes.
Every fucking paragraph is something deeply, deeply horrifying that if it was rendered in a scene in the middle of any movie would be the most awful thing in that movie.
Yeah.
And it's every page of that book. And the horror in the movie is one monologue where it's like he's reading from the book, which is fine, but it's really segregated. And these bizarre, cartoonish looking creatures, which aren't actually horrifying the way the book is horrifying. It's something else.
I agree. I was going to say, I think those moments are not the moments for horror. I think that's when they're leaning more into the Looney Tunes, into the vaudevillian, into the
Well, it's
the
also
other aspects.
monster. There's not really, even though there's the mugwump is in Naked Lunch, it's not a scary monster,
Right.
like the way it is in the movie. The movie is more akin to like the Wolf Man or Dracula or Frankenstein or something than it is to the horrors of from the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a Hellraiser quality too, though. When Kiki gets killed, like he has the centipede version of Eve Cloquet hanging off of him, and part of it's I think just the suspension and the movement and the death. You know, there's that going on. It's kind of like another like little trivia point. Cronenberg was filming Nightbreed when as the character when he was writing Naked Lunch. So you wonder like if any of like the Clive Barker element influenced him, because Clive Barker insanely influenced by Burroughs.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Actually, I forgot about that scene. That scene is one of the only moments you get a sense of the horror of Burroughs and his sense of the sexual, right? And his own kind of, he does have a sexual ambivalence, but it's not about men versus woman. It's just about sex itself is for him riddled with violence and self-loathing and grotesquerie and pleasure also. And that scene is actually kind of great. It's almost one of the few moments in the movie where it felt very Burroughs. It's both sexual and horrific at the same time. One thing, it's funny, when we first talked about this, and doing this a long time ago, this podcast and Burroughs, one thing I first was thinking about was, you know, we talked about earlier offline, which is horror for you guys a set of genre protocols, or is an experience, right? So one of the horrors of Burroughs, I can imagine, is for many people, is the groundlessness. Is the fact there's no point of identification. There's literally no ground to step on. You don't even know if you're on a planet. You don't know if you're in a country. You don't know who people you're talking to are human, not human. That ungroundedness. Right, where in horror movies you're often incredibly grounded, right? But you don't know what's coming around the corner. But it's all premised on a certain identification, which demands a ground, your point of entry in. And I always found that's scary. But I don't know if I'd ever call that horror. But again, I'm talking about words out of context, right? Outside of the use of the word horror to refer to a genre. I'm not a horror movie guy. And I just wondered about the role of horror and the role of that experience, of non-identification being the moment of horror, and whether the book, in that sense, functions as horror. Does that make sense?
At least in that I find that losing one's sense of self, losing one's identity, and that's definitely tied to drug experiences, for example, can be deeply horrifying.
Yeah.
At least it is for me. Being detached from ego. Is this something that apparently one aspires to in meditative moments, but is actually pretty soul-shattering at the same time?
Yeah, it's the goal. Yeah.
And that's fucking terrifying.
Yes.
And I mean, speaking of meditation, it's also, that becomes often in the study of meditation when people often drop off. You know, they learn to sit still, they learn a few techniques. And then right around where they become a little better at it, it's too scary.
Yes.
And they stop.
Yes.
That's pretty much across the board why everybody in America doesn't meditate, is maybe they tried it and it's not that like, oh, I couldn't sit still. It's that they like saw something.
Yeah.
Or they stopped seeing something for a moment and it freaked their shit out ever so gently enough that they were like, it's not for me.
Yeah. And it became mindfulness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Everything's about being mindful,
Yeah.
which means being better at shopping. Right? I'm really mindful of the peanut butter I buy, right? It's being present
Yes.
at work.
Yes. It's very tied to the current, meditation apps and such are
Yes.
very tied to using meditation as a tool for better performance.
Yes.
It has more to do with
productivity,
and it's akin to, I don't know, intermittent fasting and things like that
Yes.
than it is about some sort
back
of...
to Burroughs, right? It's the speed of capitalism. Capitalism will take fucking everything. It's like they turn drugs. They took LSD and turned it into Silicon Valley productivity.
Oh, it's the
LSD.
worst. I mean, I've had people. I mean, people know kind of where I'm at as far as like being a deviant and at work, you know. And I'll hear somebody be like, "Well, have you ever tried microdosing?" I was like, "No, dude. I tried macro dosing.
Exactly.
Like
It's a heroic dose, man.
I'm not trying to come in here and reach another plane of productivity. Like that's not what this is for. At least it wasn't what it was for. But there's always like a strain of Tim Ferriss-ness, which I don't quite understand in Burroughs. And I think it might just be like trying to be like attractive to other men, maybe, But like there's in one of the letters that's often attached to copies of Naked Lunch, he talks about, I've been trying the sit-up exercises I got from Doctor, and it's underscored, but no name. They've been working great. It's just so odd to me that in this whole conversation, there's like a 6-minute ab mention. Like it's right there. And then he has this other line where he says, 20 push-ups every morning. Use of junk removes fat, leaves muscle more or less intact. The addict seems to need less tissue. Would be possible to isolate the fat-removing molecule of junk? Like it's a question. It's like I could see somebody now being like, oh, heroin actually, use it with keto fasting, and it's just like, yeah, and it's always there. That's the one of the things when you talk about like where does this Burroughs stuff come from? The thing I never quite understand from him is I almost imagine him to be aligned with like a Christopher Hitchens type, being like, look, there's just chaos and all this stuff is bullshit, but he's constantly interested in like quack occult and quack mysticism and like totally credulous, where he's like, I built an orgone chamber and I sit in it.
He's obsessed with Reich, yeah. Also, he was obsessed with the Ron Hubbard's machine, a zapper.
Yeah.
He used to do it all the time.
Yeah.
He's trying to do it for himself. Yeah, but I love that he's interested in absolutely, I mean, he understood early, way before Foucault, right, that knowledge systems are control systems. Mm-hmm. Right. And that what gets led in as knowledge is not the thing to trust. Right.
Yeah.
That you have to investigate. And he's always out on his own, poking around. So, of course, he liked Reich.
What is it? This might not even be worth keeping in the podcast because it might not be interesting enough. But speaking of Tim Ferriss and Nietzsche and Burroughs, what is it about those three that produce insufferable young men?
I don't know who Tim Ferriss is, though.
He's like a Silicon...
He's like a Silicon Valley productivity guru would be a short term. Yeah, like all of the stuff that kind of has trickled into mainstream
Is he the
culture.
Workweek guy?
Yes,
Okay.
he's that guy. Okay. And you got to think, though, like it's interesting, the whole idea of only having a 4-hour work week by foisting off all of your duties on other people and like keeping a little bit of money for yourself and doing the bare minimum to work, pretty good project, right? But other people kind of came along and were like, okay, well, we used this extra space not to go, skinny dipping on mushrooms, but to start another company or do another thing. It's like, yeah, it's just weird.
Yeah. Well, that's one reason I think Burroughs is so particularly unreadable in today's world, right? Because he's working at a speed and a temperament that does not fit. There's no way Silicon Valley... Nike used him in an ad. Mm-hmm. Or he let himself be used in a Nike ad a long time ago. But capitalism doesn't really know what to do with him other than turn him just into junkie chic, right? But all his ideas, they're not palatable. I mean, the whole heroin, speed, his relationship to work, I love in the movies, like Exterminator's the best job I ever had. He's angry at his wife for using his powder. This is the best job he ever had. Right, and get the Ginsberg characters like just what the world needs, the literate exterminator. But he truly loves it.
Yeah,
and that it goes against, it's a very different notion of Silicon Valley's notion of work.
Yeah,
and he really jams up. I think of him as this kind of plasma viscosity that jams up the gears. It's not clean. I can never picture Burroughs. I mean, Burroughs might play around with microdosing. He would never call it that, right? He would just play around with recipes.
Yeah,
for different kinds of drugs, but I think he comes up the works.
But yeah, I don't know. To answer your question about what it, when you talk about insufferable men, like insufferable to who? Though?
Me.
I mean, you, but like
Most people.
yeah.
Well, I feel like there's
If who's reading Burroughs, it's becoming unsufferable. I don't know anyone who reads Burroughs other than me. And I might be unsufferable, I'll give that, but I think you're talking about a different kind of...
Well, I think that there was a sort of peak, at least in the trajectory that I can track, where I was in school. When Burroughs, when this movie came out, when Naked Lunch and a lot of other books were republished by, was it Grove Press that repressed them around that time? There was a big push around Burroughs, and it was when research were putting their books out about Burroughs and tangential ideas and Ballard, and
that's right.
There was this escalation of that stuff, and it seemed that there was a rise in young men very invested in Burroughs who were very self-serious and were taking on certain affectations of avant-garde lifestyle tropes. And every moment in history is rife with young men who are insufferable, who just can't fucking deal. And the question is, what filters do they use to just barely, to excuse their behavior and find community with 1 to 2 other people in the world? And it seems like Burroughs is a good one because, like Nietzsche, there's a sort of ethic in there that can excuse being a self-absorbed asshole. It's right there in the text. And then it becomes this thing where, like, do you blame the Grateful Dead for the people who follow the Grateful Dead? They're just a band, but they're kind of responsible for that shit. So what do you do?
Right? Can you blame the entire last 40 years of what's happened to academia on Derrida? Right?
Good point. Yes, like there's that.
Kinda.
Maybe.
But I still love Derrida. I don't know what to tell you.
Right, yeah. Anyway, I just always found that. There are some writers, and, Chad, you've talked shit about David Foster Wallace before, and or people who carry infinite jest around with them. And it's like, do you blame David Foster Wallace, or is it like, young men are going to find something to be pretentious and insufferable about, whether it's Nietzsche, Burroughs, or Wallace?
I think it's the same impulse that makes people be like, Beyonce is a queen. Anything you say otherwise is just fucking wrong. Like, you just obsess over these kind of like low-hanging pop culture weird things that kind of come into your sphere. It's like culture industry stuff, you know what I mean? Like, this weird shit from the previous generation sort of gets repackaged as a type of rebellion. I mean, like choppers, like Harley Davidsons, right? Like, a chopper was a thing that you made out of scrap parts because you were a meth head biker in the 60s and 70s. And now you can buy like an off-the-shelf production chopper for like $25,000. It's like previous generation rebellion resold. I mean, who knows what it'll look like in 10 years.
Yeah.
It's funny, the Burroughs, it's funny now, I can picture when I first got out here, the research, the whole Throb and Gristle.
Yes.
It was the same...
Absolutely.
Edition, right?
Yep.
And who's the Throb and Gristle?
Genesis Peoria?
Yeah. They were buddies.
Yes. And they were also both invested in Thelema and blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Right. But it's funny, I have a nostalgia for that time, right? Imagine now any flair of asshole men claiming the avant-garde as their mantle. Right now, instead, it's libertarianism, or it's, I don't know what the fuck people are doing now. I mean, I duck out of so many things, but, Burroughs by the last flare, right? That research probably was like 1991 or something like that. I remember that came out. It's by the last flare-up of an American avant-garde to penetrate the public discourse at all before it just disappeared altogether. So some little douchebags claiming the avant-garde, I would gladly, suffer that over another asshole talking about his app.
Fair.
If I had to choose, because they're the same fundamentally, right? The sheep are sheep. The self-righteous are the self-righteous, whether they're claiming Burroughs or, I don't know, Tim Ferriss, whoever the fuck you said.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Burroughs really was that last. I mean, I love the images, the photographs of the bunker with him sitting around with Warhol and Debbie Harry and Mick Jagger and Truman Capote, and just this last little flare-up of a public intelligentsia that even our pop culture, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you can picture now, I don't know who the big rock stars are, right? Having photographed hanging around some weird arty, junky bunker. Like, what the fuck, right? It's not even possible anymore.
Yeah.
It just doesn't exist.
Well, where I think you see that echo now is in, all the like the leaned up rappers, like all the guys who are just like crushing up Xanax and putting them in the double styrofoam cups and drinking and
stuff,
I mean, it's I think that is like the bebop of its time, and I think whatever happens is going to emerge from that.
Right.
It's
There's no avant-garde. I mean, what's funny, one thing I'm constantly surprised about with my son is he'll play me one of these things, these mumble rap guys. I don't know what the fuck is a genre name. I don't know.
Yeah, no one would self-identify as a mumble rapper, but everyone knows exactly what you mean.
There's like
when
Little
you say,
Xan, or
like the whole Xanarchy thing, and like
Slump Mask, whatever the fuck this.
Yeah, like Zan Frank, the dude with Anne Frank tattooed on his face. Like that's shit. It's interesting. Like it's funny you bring that stuff up because like Eminem has released a new track with another rapper named Logic, right? Like, so Homicide, and it's just a straightforward, serviceable Eminem track, right? But there's nothing new about it. He's not actually going to kill anyone. Like, he's never killed anyone, So for him to be like, "I slay you" or whatever, it's flat, it's not real. But like whatever's coming, like we're not going to identify it. We will, by our age and proclivities and interests, not be able to see what's coming.
There's no will to the avant-garde is my point. So my kid would be like, I'm like, what is it? I've heard of this. He goes, Dad, no, this is the thing. This guy has more views than anything. This has more downloads. It's like, really? Our whole world, right? I mean, I think about Aquarius. It was like, no, here's something only 4 people have ever heard.
Yeah, that's the difference. I think that's the real difference is there's this metric driving it now,
that's
right?
what I'm talking about,
So it's like, okay, you're a SoundCloud rapper with 2 million views.
Exactly.
Or you have, whatever. It's like the proof is in the social adoption.
Yeah, exactly.
And no one's really abandoning something once it reaches a threshold of popularity anymore. Right. I mean, I'm sure some people are like, oh, that dude's whack now or whatever.
Right.
But the search for the thing that no one's heard of, I mean, who knows? I mean, and also...
I think that is problematized now because everything is instantly available all the time.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say.
You have to be so precarious to create situations that aren't being monitored. And so it's going to naturally lean into either, no, there's shit happening that we genuinely don't know about, and there is no way for us to know about, not because it's obscure, but because it's more willfully obscure than even stuff we used to privilege as being willfully obscure. It's forcibly so because everything is being charted. And so what naturally happens is that everybody has to sort of like lean into the fact that everything's being documented and metricked. Measured. Fucking. I got to make up more words and just believe in them harder. But we definitely do come from a generation that privileges a sense of avant-garde. Yeah. That there is something noble about someone going off on their own and in a quest for some sort of alternative truth.
Yes.
And whether or not other people are along for the ride is completely irrelevant. But actually, this makes me think of a moment in the movie that I couldn't quite read, which is when the 2 other writers, I don't remember their characters' names, find all the scattered papers. And there was this moment, I don't remember the exact quote, but they say, like, let's put them all together. It'll be great. Bill, you'll get published before us. Like, did they... I mean, I don't want to valorize them as being above wanting to be published, because, like, if you're a writer, go get published. But was that... I don't know. I kind of wondered about that moment. You'll be published before us.
Yeah, but it was a different... Huh? I think it meant something different then. Right.
Well, it's like when you think about like Jack London, how many times did he write about like royalties owed and stuff like that? It was your path out, like it was a way to not have to work a square job for real. And you didn't have to do shit like go on book tours and TED Talks and all this bullshit just to make a little bit of money. Right. Like you could publish a book and boom, you made some money and you could live off of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say content now is free, right? So everything comes from being. You publish your book so that you have more followers, so that you can hawk other people's wares, right? Just become another advertiser. Yeah. So I think it has literally a different economic value when they're talking about getting published. But it is about, I mean, there's a few things here. One is, again, Burroughs wasn't a writer, and that movie doesn't quite frame it for us, but it is about him deciding to be a writer, right? Because he was always writing, and they always loved his writing. I mean, one of my favorite things is the Yage letters. It's one of my favorite things from Burroughs. If people don't, it's hard to recommend Burroughs to people, because I say I love him, and I have girlfriends be like, oh, what should I read? I was like, hey, I really can't tell you to read anything, but I'll tell them to read the Yage letters, because they're fucking hilarious.
That's the best for now, too, especially with the ayahuasca industrial complex so large right now. It's cool to read it. I think the book everyone's really looking for, though, is Junkie. Like when people come to Naked Lunch, I think what they're coming like with. I know was my experience. Like I was so invested in the myth of Burroughs before I'd ever read anything of him, and I get shut down by Naked Lunch. I'm like a suburban mall goth. I'm like, man, I don't fucking get this at all. You go read Junkie, and you're like, oh, this is like a straightforward tale. But the book you should really be reading at that point is Jack Black's You Can't Win. Right? It's basically the same book, except for it's the realer version of it. Then you can eventually find your way. Like, man, it took me a long time to like Naked Lunch.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I remember in college very clearly, like picking it up, not getting it, and then one day, I don't know, just randomly being really fucking stoned and just sitting alone at some park in Philly, and it just clicked. I never turned back after that. I was like, whoa, And in fact, it's funny. I was all day today. I was just home and deep in the Burroughs, I was tweeting all this Burroughs stuff, and this one guy tweeted back to me. He's like, he goes, I can't believe you're talking about Naked Lunch. I've been talking about it all day, and in fact, it's been the guiding force for my novel that I've been writing forever and probably keep writing forever. And he goes, and it is how else would anybody write? And I couldn't believe he wrote this, because that's, people think Burroughs is tough, but I'm like, I find traditional narratives impossible to read. Where Burroughs feels very natural to me. And from that moment on in college, when I was like, oh, I got his rhythm. I got what he was up to. I got this flow thing. I got that he was operating at the level of the discourse itself, at the level of language, that you couldn't separate form from function, and just the humor and the relentlessness and the free form felt very canny to me, as opposed to uncanny. The Yage letters are a good way in. Right? Because he's writing all this stuff, and he just had this natural humor, a natural way with language, and his absolute deadpan way of describing a city, and just dismissing a whole people offhand with this hilarious, just grotesque put down of these repulsive, Panama. This is the way he'll just dismiss them. But he was way before the super psychedelic stuff, way before the cut-ups. But he never called himself a writer. He had no identity, and he was already this figure in their lives, guiding them. That's really what that movie is kind of about, right? It's just this moment of him deciding to be a writer, whatever the fuck that means, just really professionally, to make money as a writer.
I'm surprised that he hasn't generated like a copycat mythology like the way how Lovecraft has. People will be explicitly Lovecraftian writers, and they'll write in that mythology, and they'll have their own original stories interacting with Lovecraft's characters. Yeah. I mean, the inner zone and the centipede gods and all that stuff. It seems like it seems like it would be so easy just to write a new interzone novel. Yeah.
Well, I think there are two things where that sort of happens. One is interzone as a concept comes up again and again, and I can't imagine Philip K. Dick, or saw a lot of Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard without the concept of the interzone, and that I think the drug memoir would not be what it is without. I just read Bucky Sinister's Black Hole. He's a San Francisco-based writer, and I've been kind of obsessed with this idea of recursive horror. And it sort of has that, but it turned out to be sort of his sci-fi take on a drug memoir. And it's pure Naked Lunch, but it takes place in San Francisco while hating the techies and being angry at the assholes at Ritual Coffee, while just consuming a disastrous
what's it
amount
called?
of it's black hole. I'll just give it
that.
to you. It's here somewhere.
Well, he definitely has different than what you're saying, Chad. Right? Which you're talking about this universe he created. People could spin off because there's Kathy Acker,
Right,
there's-
and she's just like a cover, like a Burroughs cover band in my opinion.
exactly.
Like I think she's
Whoa.
terrible.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Like pick up anytime you like it, to me it's something like when you listen to a band you're like, man, this band reminds me of Metallica. And you're like, Metallica is still there. You should have just listened to that. You know, like I never look at her books. Like I read like 2 of them. I can't remember anything about them other than that I felt like I should have just read Nova Express again or something like that. You know,
I mean, at the time I actually came here. She was the first person I contacted when I got out here over at SFAI. But so she played this sort of role for me, and
I'm bitter because she wouldn't let me in her writing class. So.
I asked her. I had a quick phone call with her. I was just like, because I was super into Burroughs, and I just applied to rhetoric here. It was the only, I was out here. I applied once I was here, but it was the only school I applied to, and I was like, do I want to go to grad school? I was so into this like Burroughs thing. I bought a typewriter. I was living in a basement, drinking whiskey, smoking dope, trying to write, and everything was lizards and reptilian and lots of cum and everything I wrote. And she was like, I don't know what you're asking me. And I was like, well, can I be an academic and live, I don't know, this life? She's like, I don't know what you're asking me. The conversation went nowhere. But I appreciate that she actually entertained it for 2 minutes. But you're right. After that, I never thought about her again.
yeah, and there's
You
just
know.
nothing like there's just nothing there really, in my opinion. I mean, wasn't there like weird, like I can't even remember this, but wasn't there like some like plagiarism accusations at one point or something like that?
Yeah,
with
but that's
her?
what
Yeah.
which was funny. It's like, that was her whole point. I mean, the point was displacing of the real, and she would just take existing things and.
Yeah, I mean, that was also in an era where, like, Richard Prince, and there were a lot of artists doing
Yeah.
very, very
Yeah.
deliberate acts of...
Yeah, it was deliberate. It wasn't. It's like accusing.
There's no
Richard-
accusation.
It's like
It's-
accusing Richard Prince of
Yeah, I don't
stealing a
know.
picture.
I mean,
Yeah,
it just seemed
No, but I
like that.
remember. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
But
I
it
mean, I
was-
find like a filter into a narrative to be a little bit more interesting. Like, like William Gibson's Chiba City, I think, is very much like like a Japanese inner zone, and like that creation is kind of more interesting, especially since he inspired so much cyberpunk nonsense and what came after.
Yeah. It's funny that whole association, the cyberpunk and Burroughs, because it doesn't seem that explicit to me. But I guess Nova Express and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, people were into it. Even like some of the early like hypertext novel experiments. I remember there was a
Right,
cut up
early
novel
internet.
generator.
Yeah, I was
that
gonna
you
say
could check
early
out.
internet was very Burroughs. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which makes sense. And it's funny that he's just vanished, right? From the internet, just became all consumer, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know
From all
anybody.
retail.
I don't know anybody under 30 that's read Burroughs.
Yeah,
like I
you
like.
fucking heard of him.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then like you were saying, it would just be tough to recommend him
Yeah.
at this point. It was like,
Yeah.
I don't know what you're looking for as a person.
Yeah.
This is not going to be it.
yeah. There's no way in culture. As I'm saying, that's what we're talking about. The avant-garde is how we got into this. That he was the last flare-up of an avant-garde, and it was really, I blame my generation. I don't know if you guys would put yourself in here. We were Gen X, right? We didn't want to work, had no interest in working, right? Slacker came out the year I moved out here. That was our world, right? And that was that weird Austin scene. And it was my last pit stop before coming to San Francisco was Austin. And that just does not exist now.
Yeah,
And
there's-
they couldn't even reject Burroughs. They simply couldn't recognize it. It's not something they could even choose to reject. Right? It would just ooze over them. What is this? Ugh, clean the streets, they call the cops. Right? Like, you got to get rid of this shit. This is, right? And they just call the cops for somebody put out flowers where somebody was killed. And then some neighbor, I was just reading about this on Vanishing SF.
I feel like
right?
that story. I read that story
amazing.
too. That story seems so fake to me because it's like you can like take a shit on the ground and then build a house around that out of 10 pieces, and no one stops that. Like the most dystopic area in the East Bay right now to me is the area behind the Home Depot on the Emeryville Oakland border, which is where I live, near where I live, and the homeless camp there has blown up several times. It's caught on fire a few times.
wow.
And a few days ago,
Yeah.
it caught the side of the Home Depot building on fire. And that Home Depot is like kind of like threatening to pull out of the area. They're like, look, we're taking 300 jobs and $8 million a year in tax revenue with us because you can't get this camp site cleaned out from here. And I think that there will be something weird that emerges from that whole displaced scene. Like I think that like the avant that we think might be out there, we'll never recognize it because we're,
Oh, you're saying that's what you're saying before, that you think there will be an avant-garde. We just won't even know how to recognize.
Yeah,
it.
there always is. There always is. I just think it will be like there's this like the weird hip hop screamo band that travels around in a van and plays out of their doors in Oakland. But like that sort of thing. It's like I just don't think that we'll recognize it, and that's the whole point of the avant-garde. Like you shouldn't recognize it if you're over 30.
No, that's a good call. I think I always talk about, for me, the sort of turning point in my own understanding was, I was in Brooklyn. I was in Williamsburg maybe 6-7 years ago, and I grew up in New York. We never went out to Brooklyn. So I'm constantly lost out there. I never know where the hell I am. And I'm walking down wherever the street it is that everyone lives on, or all the little hipster shops. And there's a big side of a building, big billboard painted on it. Mm-hmm. And it says, live, work, create. And I just thought I was going to vomit. I really spiraled after that trip. And I was like, where's tune in, turn on, drop out? Everyone's petty bourgeois.
Yeah.
Right? That the rise of youth culture, their aspiration is to either enslave themselves to a campus down in the peninsula or be petty bourgeois. I'm one or the other. I'm an artist because I make some fucking wire hangy thing and sell it. And what I'm wondering, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm just old, is that the very possibility of an avant-garde has been erased. Right? That culturally there is no space for it. That anything that comes out now is going to be a new thing that seeks to be monitored, measured, metriced, right? Monetized.
Thank you.
Right? And disseminated, as opposed to being a fuck you.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Warhol got big, but Warhol was fundamentally a fuck you, right? Just we're
and ultimately, fuck yous are based on metrics as well. Like, is this fuck you a good hashtag?
Right.
Retweetable.
Right.
Can I inspire your anger to get enough retweets?
Yeah. Well, this makes me think, like, kind of brings me into like the Francis Fukuyama end of history sort of territory. And like, so one of the things he mentions is like, okay, look, it's either neoliberalism or maybe somebody's going to roll some sort of weird theocratic rule. And most of the commentary on that sort of tables the theocratic rule thing, like, oh, that can't happen. I think that's where the avant emerges from, is sort of this like refundamentalization. Like, for instance, when you talk about the fuck yous, like a fuck yous you should look at and go fucking right on, right? The biggest fuck you I can think of recently is there's a UFC fighter named Khabib Nurmagomedov, and he's a very fundamental Muslim dude. He comes from Dagestan, and his faith is very important to him. And he fought Conor McGregor, who's sort of the flashiest of the flashy. Is out there hawking a vodka. Like in some way, in some ways, it's like it's capitalism versus Islam, right on the mat. And then Khabib Nurmagomedov fucking smashes Conor McGregor. And there's like a lot of bad blood between them. He jumps out of the ring, kind of gets in a fight with one of Conor McGregor's guys. And so the Nevada is basically like, hey, look, we're going to fine McGregor like $50,000. We're going to fine you like, it was something insane, like $500,000 or something like that. Or you can come they offered him this deal where he could come do a commercial for Las Vegas. And he's like, you promote alcohol, gambling, and whores. Fuck you. And he didn't do it. And to me, that is cool.
It's funny that you say that, right? Because this is the thing I find most distressing about the contemporary moment, is that the most vocal fuck you to capitalism is by fucking fundamentalist Muslims.
Yeah.
Like that you can't get a darker goddamn fucking world. It's just why I love Michel Houellebecq, because that's what he's talking about. He's like, this is the fucking world. You have the soul draining capitalist bourgeois bullshit, and you got these fucking freakazoid theological fucking assholes.
But from that freakazoid side, though, is kind of an interesting take, which is Sufism is super cool and weird and like kind of a new pathway, and it's very interzony in a weird sort of way.
Idea.
And there's like this Muslim writer, Michael Muhammad Knight, and he was sort of a protege of Hakim Bey. And there's this weird sort of new punk rocky young Islamic child sort of thing happening. And I mean, I don't know that it's right or it's going to be but it could be that there's just a return to, like, instead of like art genius, there's like religious genius, and that might be a new path for young people, because it is for young people. It's not for us.
Right.
You know,
That's interesting. I'll say that thinking about this thing, we're talking about the avant-garde, this taste, and maybe you're right. Maybe what I'm looking for is a certain Burroughs-esque, Warholian kind of gender fucky, arty smartiness. So I go to, to me, the most exciting artistic, cultural pop phenomenon has been the Ant-Word.
the great, phenomenal,
incredible.
They're on tour again. Actually,
right?
They're coming back in September 15th to San Francisco. Yeah.
That smell a little of Burroughs, smell a little of that put on beyond put on. You don't even know what to put on, what's not. It's always beyond play acting. You're always off center, right? You don't know where they're coming from. They constantly surprise you, right? And then the only other person I put in there was Zebra Cats. You know, Zebra Cats, this sort of
Little.
just this, his whole rap, I'm going to take that bitch to college and give that bitch some knowledge. I'm going to read. And it's bisexual, rapping, weird. It just has a little bit of the whiff, and it can't quite catch on. Unlike the Ant-Word, I don't understand who's listening to that, because I listen to that, I'm like, holy fuck, this is the avant-garde.
Yeah.
But they're really popular, so I don't know what I'm saying exactly here, right? But I'm wondering. I see what you're saying, which is interesting, which is that there will always be some kind of avant-garde. We just might not be able to recognize it. And I'm looking for Burroughs' moment aesthetic.
I think they'll come from. I don't think they're going to be American. I think fair enough. America, like, we've gotten to the point where, like, we've rebelled against all the things that were like bugaboos in America. Like, there's gay marriage. There's it's all done here, except for the violence thing, which, I'm pro-violence, so I'm not looking really for it to be stopped. I mean, there's reasons for that. But, like, I think that we'll see an avant-garde emerge maybe from China, where it's like super brutal. And, that's going to be an interesting place for art to emerge from. Or, places in, Saudi Arabia could have some sort of weird metal scene emerge or something like that. I think the days of, like, avant-garde coming from America are over.
That's interesting, yeah.
You mean there's too much freedom for there to be tension to create anything?
Well, I just think about, like, when you think about, like, people like, oh, left, right, there's this, like, coming, like, this internet civil Cold War that people are kind of obsessed with right now. People just really aren't that different. The concerns that people have are extremely first world. It's like, what's the big thing that people are just freaking out and just can't get their head around? It's like, transgender athletes competing in women's sports, and what are you going to do? Like, who knows? But it affects like 2% of the people, like, as far as competing goes, and it's some,
2% is generous.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the people competing, I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, what do you do with somebody who has a natural physical advantage of like 30 years of a male body suddenly smashing every record? There's no way that the top, like, records are not going to be held by transgender athletes. That's what everybody's obsessed over.
Right.
And
it's a pretty pedantic issue, is your point.
Yeah, it's just like, okay,
point, right.
But I mean, it's important to somebody, But
yeah, I think it's funny you said Mark. You said, is it because we have so much freedom? When in fact, I think it's the opposite, right? It's that everything's so controlled. Like you said, we're all basically saying the same shit. There's not much explicit rebellion. I don't know what that means, but like you said earlier, you can almost say nothing. And to me, it's the speed of capitalism, just to immediately transform anything you have, any value, into something that can be packaged and sold.
Well, my 2 cents on what can the next stage of a certain avant-garde sensibility, what can that look like, is that while everything is being to some degree controlled and regulated and observed, surveillance culture is ever growing. But I think what can happen is we're still in this period, I think, where people crave safety so badly. In this bizarre post 9/11 helicopter parenting, blah, 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 there's still this invitation for surveillance and pharmaceutical regulation and all of this. I feel like that's going to break. And perhaps the way it might break as far as art and lifestyle, avant-gardism, is for people to go hyper micro-local, instead of global cliques, micro local. I don't want to say like back to warehouse parties because that's nostalgia, but something more like that. And I hate to, we're bringing it full circle to Burroughs and his buddy Hakim Bey, and I don't want to necessarily invoke the temporary autonomous zone too exactly, but something like that. Like the idea of the temporary autonomous zone.
I love what you're saying, but is it, to me, the speed, one of the most distressing things for me is this rise of design culture, right? So that everything looks the fucking same, right? You go and everything looks like fucking ritual, whether you're in Paris, you're in London, you're in New York, you're in LA. You get the cool little shop, and then it's on Instagram, and then every shop looks like that.
Yeah.
Right? So is there possible to have a local avant-garde in an Instagram age?
I think that the entire idea is it would almost have to be sort of cult-like. It wouldn't be online. You wouldn't know about it. That we're
it was like early days. It was like
sort of like early days, but you would have to be willful about no tech, about no surveillance.
That's what I'm saying. I think
Well, it's like the romance in 1984, right? What do? They sneak off into a place with no surveillance, with some food that they've stolen to fuck somebody they shouldn't.
Right.
But I think things would have to get even worse for that sort of thing to become sort of interesting.
Yeah, and unfortunately,
but I think that this can
capitalism has done such a good job of making surveillance. You said like helicopter parents. It's become it's post Foucault's argument, right? That it becomes we want it, right? We're 1984. You're being surveyed, right? And Big Brother is anachronism. It's not the proper figure, right? We're not being watched. We watch ourselves, right?
Yes.
This argument I've tried to make elsewhere is, where the Guy Debord's argument of society of spectacle no longer holds up, right? And I've been calling this society of karaoke, right? Because the spectacle is something you look at, but karaoke, you perform it.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up karaoke because I've been thinking about like the image of the panopticon, but each cell is a karaoke room, and it's trying to catch the eye of the thing in the center, which is going to like signal boost you. Yeah. Like
you're both you are the media.
So instead of being caught and punished, you're signal boosted and rewarded by the person who's observing.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's it totally is flipped. All those old figures, including the panopticon, Guy Debord, all that stuff is quickly made irrelevant. The speed of capitalism, the quick of the surveillance state to flip the eye around. So you're not being watched, you are watching and desiring your own watching, right? I mean, the selfie is the obvious recursive loop there.
But I want to insert tech into this even still, because despite surveillance culture, if we take something like cryptocurrency as a model and look at an avant-garde is it's definitely about creating your own space and protecting your own space and your own ideas and it being exclusive from the mainstream in some way, the man, whatever. There's definitely an us and them in the avant-garde. That right now we've got cryptocurrency as very much an easy way to sort of think about it.
Yeah.
Without, talking about like the dark web, which is also part of it, but that's not quite what I'm talking about. That ideas that are coded for us in the avant-garde can be literally coded.
That's nice.
With code.
Yeah.
With script.
That's good.
And that it can all be right out there in front of everybody and no one can see it.
Yeah, that's good. It's funny. I almost mentioned the crypto thing because I think that's going to be the next war in a lot of ways, right? Control over it.
I think what's going to happen is more like you're talking about the speed of capitalism. I wrote an article about Bitcoin like a while back, and I went to a couple Bitcoin meetups. And I went to one before it spiked over $1,000 and one that was after. And the value of the currency completely changed the scene. Like the first time I went, it was a bunch of kind of anarchist programmers, skinny kids with mohawks and black nail polish and stuff. And then the second time I went, it looked like
Tech Bros.
Yeah. I mean, it was weirdos too. There are actually some interesting things. There was a guy trying to get people to give money to fund Syrian rebel arms, which is interesting. He's like, you can, give us some money and we will fight the good fight. And I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. And there was this Russian guy who I could never understand his business model, but it was basically like, you would give him cryptocurrency and he would exchange bullion to you. I'm like, what, do you just have a bunch of stolen gold that you're trying to fence? Is that what's going on here? It was kind of interesting. Like the shadiness of it was weird. But now it's like, I saw a cryptocurrency bus ad on my way over here.
I know.
Yeah.
I have a crypto startup.
Oh.
Yeah, launching a coin. Yeah, it's changed a lot since I got involved a year and a half ago because of SEC regulations and all this stuff. Yeah. To me, the possibilities. It's like the early internet, though. We all said internet it will be this free reign of information. There'll be no censor, but of course, it was a naive understanding of network culture. Right? Everything goes towards hyper monopolization rather than dissemination.
Yeah.
And the idea of crypto is decentralization will actually undo that. But of course, crypto also has the possibility of, I think about Ubic, of hyper monetizing and surveying every moment, down to the microtransaction, all through smart contracts, right? It's always already monitored and monetized. And that's my bigger fear, is that it becomes I know I'm attracted to the crypto anarchist side of things, but there's also clearly going to be a rise of crypto fascism, which is, I assume, is going to come. Fast and hard.
I don't think there. I mean, I don't mean this in like I mean this in a financial value way. Yeah. I don't think there's a financial value in cryptocurrency in the way that the anarchist wants to use it. It's more like a fetish. Like, I want to be secretive or whatever. And like secretive, well, what can you do with that? Ultimately, it's like you can be off the grid in your own particular way, but once you're gone, you're like a ghost. You don't matter to the system anymore. Or you can be off the grid to do something shady. So it's like, okay, it has black market utility, but beyond that, I just don't see it being adopted massively for its black market utility.
Imagine not having to pay taxes, just not being tied to the American currency. Incredible, right? And fucking incredible. And I think Burroughs would have a fucking field day with this.
Yeah, I feel like he would probably fixate on some very non-useful part of it, because like his whole approach to technology in general was he was just like moth to a flame to the most useless of the useless technologies.
Yeah.
I mean, like he recommended some book that's just basically like how to build an orgone shelter in your house, and it was on his reading list of important books. And you're like,
yeah, he built one. He hung out in his orgone box.
Yeah, he owned one of Wilhelm Reich's boxes. It was like an item for him to have. And you're like, man. And I felt a little bit of like kinship with that, because like, when I was in high school, very interested in like aliens and crystal skulls and all this shit. And you're like, oh, quartz crystal, you can meditate on it and increase your IQ. Like if you're not at all scientifically literate in any way, and you look at something that seems fairly scientifically literate, you just sort of take it at face value at a certain age. But you're like, Burroughs is a grown ass man. I mean, it seems like.
Yeah, but Wilhelm Reich is pretty cool, man. I mean,
I mean, there's a lot of when I was working at farmers markets, there's a lot of people who were into that Rudolf Steiner Reich type of stuff, and there's parts that make sense and parts that don't make sense. Like, okay, if you do bury a horn in your field, there's maybe you're introducing calcium into wherever, but there's like a mythopoetic reason for doing it too, which has no utility. Like I don't know.
To be honest, I always love Burroughs' love of weird knowledge systems and taking them. I love that he takes them totally seriously.
Yeah.
To me, that's the beauty of it. It's just like, there's other knowledge systems, man. And everything you guys think is real. He's like, whatever. I think that's a scam. This is the shit. I'm sitting in my box in my backyard covered in whatever the fuck the orgone box is covered in.
The thing too, though, is like it does tune you. Like paying attention to that sort of, like something I've been interested in lately is like evangelical like Christianity, like from the especially this weird like sub economy of like Christian capitalism, which is sort of like 1950s. Like they're not really trying to dominate everything, but they're just trying to have like a business or something like that. And I was thinking about like a lot of the people who are in that space, I'm kind of like weirdly attracted to, because they kind of sort of have their shit together, and and they're not concerned about a bunch of nonsense. It's like a lot of these people seem to have very low anxiety, and it's like they've chosen to believe in this thing, which I almost consider a technology, and it's just reduced a lot of the anxieties of capitalism for them, and they're able to become more successful just in general, like on whatever measurement you would choose, by being associated with this sort of thing. The same thing like Mormons. Like Mormons tend to be like,
I have a good Mormon friend who's very successful, very religious.
yeah,
And you were describing it made me think of him. He's
Yeah.
just happy with his life, makes a lot of money, very focused, very good guy.
yeah,
Beautiful family, great wife. I mean, he's just,
yeah. All the things that you sort of like are supposed to want.
Yeah.
And like I have a Mormon buddy who's very successful too, and when the more I learn about like the way they like kind of organize themselves and even the way they raise children it seems very like the right way to do it. They make the kids speak in church for like 45 minutes at a time so that later on in life they don't have anxieties about speaking in front of people.
Yeah.
Like, whoa. And talk about apocalypse survival, Salt Lake City is going to be fine.
Yep.
Like they have, they're just built for survival. It's just, it's interesting to me. Like,
Totally.
and to me, there's like especially in the Bay Area, there's a bit of like a subcultural feel to it. Like if you were to go join like a church in San Francisco and you work in tech, you would be fucking weird.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a pleasure in that, I think.
Yeah.
Like
It's funny, I know we're way off topic here at this point. My friend, I worked with him and we became friends, and he lived in the Bay Area, and he's sort of a dork, and then he ended up moving to Salt Lake City. And at first he was like, he goes, "Oh, Daniel, it's the worst." He goes, "I don't know any songs, so I'm just walking through the store and I'm just humming, a hymn. Mm-hmm. In San Francisco, no one knows what I'm doing. I'm just out shopping." He goes, and I do it out here, and they come up to me and go, "Oh, sing it, brother. You're telling, He's like, "Just let me be, man. I'm just singing my song, And he's very religious. He's high up in the church, but he kind of liked that he was a weirdo. He's super square, super straight, khaki pants, his little blue shirt, Boy Scout, literally, his Boy Scout troop thing. But he kind of liked that he was a weirdo. He was the weirdest guy in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And when he moved there, he began to love it. But
I think there's something
that.
to like kind of bring it back to Burroughs a little bit. Like he was sort of a square for his scene, I think was maybe sort of the appeal to him, while everybody else is like white t-shirt and chinos, he's wearing a suit, like, which is weird.
Going back, we talked so much about his ethics and his relationship to the public and the avant-garde, but the fact that he was always polite. Mm-hmm. He actually taught me the value of politeness. The politeness is the key figure in an anarchist state, right? Because it gives me my space. You know what I mean? Without conflict. Otherwise, you're just bumping heads and you're just expending all this energy, right? Or you don't want to be false nice and be friends with everyone. You want either one. Politeness is fucking critical to allow the chaotic world to keep functioning and everyone to mind your own fucking business, right? Without conflict. So he was always polite, always well-dressed, and it was about just leave me the fuck alone, right? And that's why I called him the, El Hombre Invisible, right? He was the invisible man. Just, I don't want to show up. I don't need to disrupt. I'm not punk rock.
Yeah, we've talked about the manners thing before.
Yeah. But I think it's an important part of him. And I think there is this kind of square side because he is coming cultural. I mean, just generational. He's a generation older than those guys, right? I mean, he's still talking about, he's obsessed. He went to like elementary, high school, private school, in
Missouri.
No, when he was young, he got shipped off to where they build the bomb in New Mexico. And so he's still, he grew up with that, them making the bomb, right? Generationally, it's just other world, right? It's like my shrink is this 9-year-old guy. Every session, he was talking about the Nazis, right? No one talks about the Nazis anymore, right? But he grew up, every session, he talked about the Nazis, just culturally. So Burroughs is this other generation than those guys. But he actually just had a different belief, right? He had different ethics, right? Just leave me the fuck alone. He was no peacenik like Ginsberg. He's just like, he's strapped. And leave me the fuck alone.
Well, it's also, along with that, is that he got recognition pretty late in life.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think it's a lot of lost years, but lost years can, shooting up and all that, don't necessarily accumulate into, they might accumulate into some experiences, but they don't necessarily accumulate into a good writer.
Well, one of the best things, one of my favorite things about Burroughs, we talk about the Yage letters, is thinking about now. On the Facebook, I get served up ads for ayahuasca retreats in full comfort. he's flying all over Central and South America, talking to medicine men, weird outposts of diplomats, anyone he can talk to, getting machetes, hiking into the backcountry to try to take the stuff. He's just spent months doing that. I just love that. He's nobody. He's
He
living
never
off.
really finds it either, right? Like I kind of remember, like they give him like kind of a low dose.
He gets a couple, and he finally has his one
and
experience.
And it's definitely not what people describe now.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if they just figured out a new way of cooking it down, the way they figured out the crack. You know, it made it more powerful. But Anthony Bourdain had a similar description of it. Well, you know, he was a Burroughs obsessive, and he talked about when he went to go down to try ayahuasca, it was just not that strong, and he was like, he kind of called bullshit on it, and then you know the other podcasters like, dude, you'll light your fucking brain on fire if you get the right whatever. But,
I mean, Burroughs claimed that, but yeah, in the book, it's only successful like once or twice, right?
Yeah.
And he doesn't go into depths about it. The only thing that's great about it is then, you know, he's writing the letters to Ginsberg. And then in the postscript of the book, Ginsberg goes down years later and does it and then writes the letters to Burroughs. And he couldn't handle it all. He's just like, this is scary shit, man. He's just like a nice Jewish boy should not be doing fucking ayahuasca.
I always felt like Ginsberg was the lamest of the beats.
He's the greatest American poet.
It was, for some reason, like he just never.
I think he's the greatest poet in America.
Yeah, I mean, I like people say that, you know, I give it to
master.
But yeah, I read a lot of them too, and it just never resonated with me.
That's funny. Yeah, I gave this talk to a high school. I ended up Skyping with some AP English class, and they invited me to come in, and they were in a class in the 60s. I had assigned them Howl, and then was talking about it, and so all this shit's so fresh in my head. But I used to teach Howl all the time, and my experience with it was I thought it always felt goofy, and then one day I was living out here, I don't know, I just picked it up random, it was lying around, I don't even know if it was my copy, I don't know whose copy it was, and I just started reading out loud to myself, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe his rhythm. It became like this incantation. And I realized how unbelievably sophisticated and bizarre and fucked up his rhythm is. And then I just became obsessed with it. And, you know, like any poet, you know, 3% of the work is great, like most poets. And but his 3% that's great is fucking great.
Yeah. I mean,
and I'm a sucker. I also love that he was such a champion of all his buddies and getting everybody published and created the beats. There wouldn't be no beats if it weren't for him. He basically invented it.
Yeah.
Kept talking about themselves as a generation. And
I mean, Naked Lunch certainly wouldn't have existed without him.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way.
Yeah.
Like,
absolutely not. Yeah. And we wouldn't know Burroughs if it weren't for.
yeah. And didn't he like straight up edit Nova Express?
No,
and then there's like, I think several of Burroughs' books were just like not in a state, and Ginsberg tuned them up and put them out there. It kind of reminds me, there's this, I cannot remember her name, but there's a book about the editor of a bunch of children's books. She was like Maurice Sendak editor. It's Dear Genius is the name of the book. And you realize like how important the role of the editor is. Like so many of these like great books you think are like, you just come out of people like naturally.
That's funny, yeah.
And the editor is so important.
Right.
But
It's not surprising, yeah. I'm a fan of Ginsberg.
Yeah, I'll have to give him another chance, I guess. I just haven't.
I recommend reading Howl out loud.
I've read it so many times. Yeah.
So where are we with Naked Lunch?
Yeah, I mean, just practically speaking, for people who want to know about Burroughs, I always recommend Western Lands. I think Western Lands is the greatest book ever written. I think it's readable as long as you're not looking for a story. But he takes philosophical flights. It's lucid while being hilariously funny, incredibly smart, and it's all about immortality. Explicitly, that's what the Western Lands are. And his whole send-up of the Egyptians, right? And his bashing of the whole Egyptian model for immortality is so funny. He's like, it's bureaucratic. And their mistake of assuming the body is the way to immortality is just fucking fantastic. So yeah, I mean, Naked Lunch is fun and has its moments, but I think that final trilogy, Place of Dead Roads, Cities of the Red Night, and Western Lands is just fucking astounding. And all his writing at the end, My Education, The Book of Dreams, and then his book on cats, The Cat Inside. It's fucking fantastic.
Have you read that new one, the Boy Scout manual?
I saw you mention that. I didn't know that, yeah.
It just came out last year. It basically reads like a modern like how to be a terrorist right now in this media moment.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's very like there's something very Valerie Solanas about it.
Huh.
You know, like go kill somebody big and important, and then tell your manifesto. Like that's basically what it tells. You know, and like I read it the same week of the New Zealand massacre, and you're like, man, it's almost as if this dude had read this book.
wacky,
you know,
huh?
It's really kind of an interesting. Like, that's one of the things about Burroughs. Is like a lot of his crazier ideas seem to come true later.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I think he's prescient. I don't think, still don't think he's been reckoned. I think it's one of the problems. People do this. Castaneda also. Burroughs is one of these people where they get dismissed as a kind of novelty, you know. And I think Castaneda is one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. You know, I think he's one of the great pedagogic models, post-Platonic pedagogic models. And I think Burroughs is not just one of the greatest writers, just in terms of just literature, whatever the fuck that means, but his understanding of the war on drugs, the surveillance state, and the relationship just between and the status of the political. And I mean, he never bought into any of the bullshit and was always operating at this other level very early on. And I don't think we've still quite plugged into it. You know, I think he's yet to be recognized. I don't know what that even means, but it sounds like something you're supposed to say.
Sure.
Yeah. I wonder like what like the movement to like bring him back into culture will look like. Because we've had a few biopic movies in the last 15 years that are terrible. Just not that interesting. I mean, I can almost imagine like somebody like Nicholas, what's his name?
Winding Refn?
Like taking on Western Lands or something like that. Because, you know, like that director's friends with like Jodorowsky. You wonder, like, when I watched like Cronenberg's Naked Lunch, I sort of wonder like, what would Jodorowsky's Naked Lunch look like?
I like that.
What happens, you know, you like take crazy and mix it together. Does it make something better or does it kind of negate it? But I don't know, like film is so expensive now to do anything with. I don't know.
What's funny, one person we haven't talked about, it usually comes up with Burroughs is Pynchon. Mm-hmm. And I was blown away with what P.T. Anderson did with Pynchon. I think Inherent Vice is my favorite movie of all time.
It's good.
I think it's the greatest fucking movie ever made. But he got so far up Pynchon's ass. I mean, he got deep in there, man. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a hard thing to film. And just to keep you, just like reading Pynchon, where you're just, is it coming together or not coming together? Constantly coming together and undoing itself in the exact same time. And I know Burroughs is probably way outside of PTA's wheelhouse. Mm. But I could see something going on there, right? I mean, he pushes a little more into the weird, you know. Jodorowsky's a better call.
Yeah.
But I was impressed with what could happen. I think, paranoia is one of those things that gets ascribed to postmodern fiction or something. Mm. But it's funny thinking about both those guys, right? For Pynchon, the whole point is it paranoia or not? Does it all make sense, or am I just paranoia is simultaneously there and not there, right? Yeah. And that's the whole thing. Do you have faith and believe everything makes sense or not, right? And that's the way of sense. So it's in a way he will never have been paranoid. And for Burroughs too, he's not paranoid. This is the world. It is trying to kill you. You should be strapped. It's not paranoia. That I always thought paranoia is a misreading, right? And that's the surveillance state trying to convince you you're paranoid, that it was a misreading of postmodern.
Shall we leave it there?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think we did pretty good. Covered a lot of territory.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's fade to black and roll the credits. Starting with encouraging you to join our mailing list, which you can do at scarythoughts.org. Give us your info. We'll respectfully keep it private and keep you up to date on things with recommendations and extra information about this podcast. And Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's super fun.
Yeah, that was great. Really enjoyed that. And we will see you all next time for Zombieland.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Where'd you get the NPR voice from, Mark?
Canada.
Canada, yeah.
Yeah.
Good breeding.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
Yeah.